seen a mouse.
I think
Blind eyes do not go. Wise men, wild men, 18 straight whiskies. I think that's the record. I think light, it dies. I've seen a mouse, I've seen the gates.
Is the bloody man dead?
Dylan Thomas died on November the 9th, 1953, in St. Vincent's Hospital, New York, where he had lain in a coma for several days. People have argued ever since about the real cause of death. Pneumonia, liver failure, alcoholic poisoning, diabetes. Nobody can be certain.
Grave men, do not go. The light, the night, the dying of the night.
What is certain is that when he died, at the age of 39, Dylan Thomas was a poet of world stature, one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, one of the greatest poets that Wales has ever produced, in English or in Welsh. He was a poet of the world and a man of Wales. His complex, often difficult poems and brilliant stories had taken him from Cwmdonkin Drive, Swansea, to a central position on the world stage, and then to St. Vincent's Hospital, New York, New York, in a coma.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learn too late they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
I don't like poetry, actually.
Why?
It's self-indulgent. It's not as clear as other art forms are. No, I read a little bit at school, but that's about it, yeah.
A poem in the Express every day, and sometimes they're very funny.
I like Wandsworth, and I like some of the Thomases, and I like the bleak poetries, you know, nothing politics.
Are you interested in poetry yourself?
Yes, yeah, sort of.
How kind of, sort of?
Some of it's good, some of it's not good.
And what do you think of Dylan Thomas?
I don't know.
What's the poetry today isn't poetry. Not poetry, it's reading.
I like poetry
that rhymes.
That rhymes.
No, I'm not into poetry. Rap music.
It's the way forward.
A good man, a wise man, a wild man. Some would say that Dylan Thomas was none of these. Others would say that he was all three. You shake the kaleidoscope of his life, and you see what you want to see.
Where are we going?
Up there.
Why?
Because
Because what?
Because you can breathe up there. Because you can see for miles.
Because?
Well, because you have to.
Why?
Come on, I'll tell you a story as we go.
I was born in a large Welsh industrial town at the beginning of the Great War. An ugly, lovely town, or so it was and is to me. Crawling, sprawling, slummed, unplanned, jerry-villaed and smug-suburbed by the side of a long and splendid curving shore, where truant boys and Sandfield boys and old anonymous men in the tatters and hangovers of 100 charity suits, beachcombed, idled and paddled, watched the dock-bound boats threw stones into the sea for barking outcast dogs, and on Saturday summer afternoons listened to the militant music of salvation and hell fire preached from a soapbox. This sea town was my world.
Dylan Thomas was born in this house, number 5 Cwmdonkin Drive, on the 27th of October, 1914, in the part of Swansea called, for obvious reasons, the Uplands, an affluent middle-class suburb of this city village. His father was David John Thomas, born in 1876. The Thomas family lived in Johnstown, near Carmarthen, where Dylan's grandfather was a guard on the railways. D.J. Thomas had gone to university and had become a teacher of English at Swansea Grammar School. Dylan's mother was Florence Hannah, née Williams, born in Swansea in 1882. Her father had come from Llangain, near Carmarthen, again to work on the railways. She was brought up in Delhi Street, in the St. Thomas part of Swansea. There were many children in the Williams household, a happy band who, grown into preachers, dockers and farmers, appear as Dylan's fabulous aunts and uncles, as aunts who wore wool next to the skin, and who sent nasty scratching vests as Christmas presents, as poor Aunt Bessie who, having been frightened
Twice
by a clockwork mouse, sought consolation in elderberry wine, as
Auntie Anna rather given to port.
who stood in snow in the back garden,
Singing,
uncles,
trying out their Christmassy guards, coughing, trying again, sitting, buttons loosened, collars off, huffing and puffing, and finally sleeping in front of the fire.
while the children roamed the Arctic wastes of Sketty in search of brandy-bearing St. Bernards and hippopotami.
And ghosts, and trolls,
Wolves and...
and it snowed.
Dear boy, did it snow?
Such was Swansea for Dylan Thomas all those years ago. A Swansea peopled with love and wonder, full of magic and excitement. So many years ago, so many miles from New York. And although this was the world in which Dylan lived, there was another world, even more magical, just beyond the horizon. Just a few miles away, people spoke a different language and lived a different life on their farms and in their bustling, lively villages. Both of Dylan's parents spoke Welsh, not English, as their first language. Both families came from the west, from rural, Welsh-speaking, chapel-going Carmarthenshire. Here there was a different set of aunts and uncles, still larger than life, but larger than a different life. Here there was an aunt and an uncle with a farm and hangmen.
And ducks and pigs and hens, and a lovesick would-be minister cousin who preached to the animals and dreamed of hell, and actresses.
And an uncle who ate pig's haw, and drunken gypsies, and a grandfather who rode ghost horses at night in his bed, and where they had road signs for ducks.
I'm exaggerating again.
No, indeed, not this time. It really was like that. Well, almost. Perhaps not all the time. Perhaps that is exaggerating a little.
Perhaps a little. Perhaps not. It is the compressing of experience, the gift for choosing the most telling detail, the magical ability to say not only how things really are, but how they appear to us in our own minds, that makes Dylan Thomas's world so real, and which makes the real world seem so poor in comparison. These are among the gifts that make him such an unusual and such an appreciated poet. For his childhood, even exaggerated, just a little, is the childhood that we would all have liked, even if it was not the one we had.
Where were these magic horses then? I thought you lived in Swansea.
The Celts have always known that paradise is in the west, in the magic islands beyond the sea that poets praised in times we no longer know of. For Dylan, paradise was only 25 miles away from the ugly, lovely town, at the farm where his mother's sister Anne lived. The poem Fern Hill is one of the most glorious songs to childhood ever written, and remains perhaps the greatest poem Dylan wrote.
Now, as I was young and easy under the apple boughs about the lilting house, and happy as the grass was green, the night above the dingles starry, time let me hail and climb golden in the heydays of his eyes. And honoured among waggons I was prince of the apple towns, and once below a time I lordly had the trees and leaves trail with daisies and barley down the rivers of the windfall light. And as I was green and carefree, famous among the barns about the happy yard, and singing as the farm was home, in the sun that is young once only, time let me play and be golden in the mercy of his means. And green and golden I was huntsman and herdsman, the calves sang to my horn, the foxes on the hills barked clear and cold, and the Sabbath rang slowly in the pebbles of the holy streams. All the sun long it was running, it was lovely, the hay fields high as the house, the tunes from the chimneys, it was air and playing lovely and watery, and fire green as grass. And nightly, under the simple stars, as I rode to sleep, the owls were bearing the farm away. All the moon long I heard, blessed among stables, the night jars flying with the ricks, and the horses flashing into the dark. And then to awake, and the farm, like a wanderer white with dew, come back, the cock on his shoulder. It was all shining, it was Adam and maiden, the sky gathered again, and the sun grew round that very day. So it must have been after the birth of the simple light, in the first spinning place, the spellbound horses walking warm out of the whinnying green stable onto the fields of praise.
Although Dylan Thomas was a sickly child, and although he claimed throughout his life to be afflicted with various interesting diseases, the picture that he gave of his childhood was that of the sublimely unself-conscious joy of an active and quite normally ill-behaved boy. At the age of 11 he was admitted to the grammar school. His father was the senior teacher of English at this school, and he managed to inspire many of his pupils with a love of literature. Dylan was no exception, and from 1925 to 1931 he always came top in English. Unfortunately, the other teachers did not inspire the young Dylan Marlice Thomas with a similar love of their subjects. In fact, his school career was distinguished by an unrivalled record. With the exception of English, bottom of the class in most years and in most subjects. Perhaps Dylan Thomas was no better or no worse, but he was certainly different, for poets, unlike little boys, do not come in their thousands. And not only did he edit the school magazine, but he wrote poems and literary criticism that revealed the genius lurking in this unusual adolescent. While still at school, he started his notebooks, in which most of his poems are found in one form or another. Between 1930 and 1934, he wrote some 250 poems, including half of the poems he ever published. However, as somebody once said, man does not live by poetry alone. Dylan Thomas may well have been a poet, even a prodigy, but he was also a young man with some decidedly bad habits and some most unpoetic urges. Even at that time, money burned an awful hole in Dylan's pocket, as it was to do throughout his life. And so he rushed into life with his £2 and his small body, eager to live before he received the dubious, double-edged gift of serenity. So from July 1931, when Dylan Thomas left school at the age of 16, to November 1934, when he left for London, he wrote many poems. He also lived, worked, played, made friends, drank, smoked, flirted, acted and talked.
Evening pubs!
In the autumn of 1931, Dylan was taken on by the South Wales Daily Post, at first as a proofreader, and then as a reporter. He did his rounds of the hospitals and the courts, and, cigarette in mouth, he retired for coffee and for stronger drinks. Dylan's mind was not really on his job. Life was much too interesting for that, drunk or sober. The pattern of Dylan's life, laziness in unimportant things, drunkenness, irresponsibility, was established early. Even his acting at the Little Theatre came to an end when he tried the director's patience once too often by slipping out for a drink during the dress rehearsal. So the poet dragged his little body from the Uplands Hotel to the Marine, to the Antelope, to the Mermaid, and to the Little Theatre, and he acted and talked and laughed and smoked and drank. And he wrote. He wrote about life and death and sex, the big questions. Not a dead dog or a sports day in sight. He gave the title of Deaths and Entrances to his third book of poems because, as he said at the time, that is all I ever write about or want to write about. It is his fear of death and his interest in sex, or vice versa, which predominated in his early poems. To convey his ideas, he developed a style that was dense and complex, at times using words for their sound and rhythm rather than for their meaning, piling images one upon another, creating work of great and at times impossible, infuriating obscurity. Slowly his poems went beyond South Wales, and people started to notice this strange new voice. In May 1933, Dylan was published in London for the first time. In September of that year, a poem appeared in Poets' Corner in the Sunday Referee, and this was the decisive step on the way to the fame, the fortune, and to the loves that awaited him. Within a year he was famous, within literary circles at least. Within a year he had embarked upon his first love affair with Pamela Hansford Johnson, an attractive young poet from London. Within a year, a volume of his poems was due to be published. But he still lived at home with his parents in Swansea. Decisions had to be made.
Shall we go? Reaching Barrowed? Are you ready?
Where are we going now?
To the top.
Do we have to?
You can see the whole world from the top, everything. Seas, cities, everything. On a clear day.
Have you heard of Dylan Thomas?
I should do,
Why is that?
because I've lived here all my life, so I should know him.
Oh, he's an amazing man, wasn't he? He got the hearts and souls of people going, didn't he? He's Welsh, and that's about all I know.
It's got some nice ones. You know, well, I can understand what he's on about.
What do you know about Dylan Thomas?
Nothing. He comes from Swansea, didn't he?
It's not very often that you get a poet, local poet from Wales. All the other poets you see are all English or foreign. But he's a Welshman, you know what I mean? Born and bred here.
What do you know about him?
Very little. Or he's just from Swansea. That's about it.
What about him as a man? Do you know anything about him as a person?
No. Drunkard.
He was he?
Bit of a chap.
He's always in debt most of the time. Very creative writer. Got more recognition when he died. Died young.
Well, I've seen one of his plays and I was not impressed. I thought it was a load of rubbish and a waste of good money.
What about his poetry?
Is that what they call it? A nice poet but a drunken bum.
So he went away, did he?
Well, things are never that simple.
In the old days, Celts were fascinated by in-between worlds, by twilight mists and water, worlds where you never really knew what was what. That is why we celebrate Halloween. That is why we throw coins in a fountain. One of the old gods even had two faces, so that he could look in two directions at once. Swansea also has two faces. It speaks two languages. It sits between the industrial valleys, with a radical urban proletariat, and the rural hinterland, where the ancient language and culture of Wales flourishes. Swansea, like the god of old, looks in two directions. Increasingly, Dylan Thomas looked in two directions, inwards at Swansea, outwards at London. What he saw in these directions depended on his needs at any one time. But in 1933, without work, without money, what he saw was not very attractive.
The small industrial towns I passed in the bus coming down here, each town a festering sore on the body of a dead country. Half a mile of Main Street with its Prudential, its Co-op, its Star, its cinema and pub. On the pavements I saw nothing but hideously pretty young girls with cheap berets on their heads and paint smudged over their cheeks. Thin youths with caps and stained fingers holding their cigarettes. Women, all breast and bottom, hugging their purses to them and staring in at the shop windows. Little colliers, diseased in mind and body as only the Welsh can be, standing in groups outside the welfare hall.
In his desire to impress the sophisticated girlfriend from the big city, Dylan dismissed even things of value in his life, in his adolescent bombast.
It's impossible for me to tell you how much I want to get out of it all. Out of the narrowness and dirtiness, out of the eternal ugliness of the Welsh people and all that belongs to them, out of the pettiness of a mother I don't care for and the giggling batch of relatives.
Yet this was the only place he knew, and he was afraid to leave it. In Ears in the Turrets Here, written in 1933, he describes this problem more accurately and more profoundly. In the poem, the poet does not know whether to open or lock the door to the outside world. Dylan, like many extroverts, was extremely timid, and he was afraid of this world for which he lusted so much, not knowing whether it would hold poison or grapes for him.
Ears in the turrets hear, hands grumble on the door, eyes in the gables see the fingers at the locks. Shall I unbolt or stay alone till the day I die, unseen by stranger eyes in this white house? Hands, hold you poison or grapes? Hands grumble on the door, ships anchor off the bay, rain beats the sand and slates. Shall I let in the stranger? Shall I welcome the sailor? Or stay till the day I die? Hands of the stranger and holds of the ships, hold you poison or grapes?
In November 1934, he went to London, and he drank and he wrote. And when he was in London, he wanted to be in Wales. So he came back to Wales, and he drank, and he wrote. And when he was in Wales, he
wanted to be in London.
What?
What? Nothing. Just remembering.
Come on then. So did he come back?
Things are never that simple.
He needed what his biographer called a womb with a view. Wales was his womb, but it was stifling. At least so he thought when he was in it. The view was in London, and later in America, and it was exciting, profitable, but frightening. For 15 years, between 1934 and 1949, Dylan Thomas travelled between his two worlds. Meanwhile, Dylan was proving successful and popular in London, both the inner, real Dylan and the outer, dramatised Dylan. His first book, 18 Poems, was so successful that a major publisher agreed to publish a second volume. In September 1936, 25 Poems was published, a collection of work almost entirely written before he left Swansea. Unfortunately, not content with being a poet of genius, he set out to play the part that he imagined a poet of genius should play. Poets, he thought, were not ordinary people. Poets drank, and so he drank. Poets chased women, and so he chased women. Poets were rude, and so on and so on. And he adopted the role of the terminally ill, drunken, foul-mouthed, eccentric, convention-scorning, unwashed, girl-chasing poet. In 1936, he met Caitlin McNamara, a fiery dancer from a cultured Irish family. Their tumultuous love affair started immediately, punctuated by spectacular and often public fights and reconciliations. They married in 1937, and they fought and loved together for the rest of their lives. Dylan the poet became also Dylan the husband, and from January 1939, Dylan the father. He remained Dylan without money, and Dylan who drank. Paradise had given way to the lesser world of the adult. Yet no matter how far he moved from paradise, Dylan never ceased either to long for it or to describe it in his work. In The Hunchback in the Park, written in 1941, he looked back wistfully to Cumdonkin Park, a paradise shared by wild boys as innocent as strawberries, and by the hunchback. Dylan gives a compassionate and understated picture of the outsider, plagued and persecuted by innocent yet cruel children, and who strives to create perfection in a world which neither understands nor wants to understand.
The hunchback in the park, a solitary mister, propped between trees and water from the opening of the garden lock that lets the trees and water enter until the Sunday sombre bell at dark, eating bread from a newspaper, drinking water from the chained cup that the children filled with gravel in the fountain basin where I sailed my ship, slept at night in a dog kennel, but nobody chained him up. Like the park birds he came early, like the water he sat down, and Mister, they called, hey, Mister, the truant boys from the town, running when he'd heard them clearly, on out of sound, past lake and rockery, laughing when he shook his paper, hunchbacked in mockery, through the loud zoo of the willow groves, dodging the park keeper with his stick that picked up leaves. And the old dog sleeper, alone between nurses and swans, while the boys among willows made the tigers jump out of their eyes to roar on the rockery stones, and the groves were blue with sailors. Made all day until bell-time, a woman figure without fault, straight as a young elm, straight and tall from his crooked bones, that she might stand in the night, after the locks and chains, all night in the unmade park, after the railings and shrubberies, the birds, the grass, the trees, the lake, and the wild boys innocent as strawberries, had followed the hunchback to his kennel in the dark.
But neither Dylan nor the world were young any more, and innocence was long gone. The hunchback could find peace neither in the park nor in his kennel.
And did he never come back?
Think so.
Never that simple.
In 1938 he went to Larne, to a cottage that the novelist Richard Hughes had found for him. Here he found a haven, where hunchbacks were accepted as quite normal. He found the compromise that he needed, a world that accepted both his qualities and his failings, and a world in which he could hide when necessary, but from which he could escape whenever necessary. Suddenly, his work changed from introverted poems written solely about himself to stories which recreate the wonder of an external world. The Swansea of the 1930s that he described so viciously to his girlfriend in 1933 is transmuted now into a picture of quiet despair, familiar to those without hope and without joy, to all those with nowhere to go, be they in Swansea or Swindon or Seattle.
Standing alone under a railway arch out of the wind, I was looking at the miles of sands, long and dirty in the early dark, when two young men joined me, it seemed out of nowhere, and struck matches for their cigarettes and illuminated their faces under bright checked caps. The strangers huddled against the wall, their hands deep in their pockets. Night was properly down on us now. The wind changed. Thin rain began. The sands themselves went out. We stood in the scooped, windy room of the arch, listening to the noises from the muffled town. A good strange shunting. A siren in the docks. The hoarse trams in the streets far behind. One bark of a dog. Unplaceable sound. Iron being beaten. The distant creaking of wood. Doors slamming where there were no houses. An engine coughing like a sheep on a hill. The two young men were statues smoking, touch-capped and collarless watchers and witnesses carved out of the stone of the blowing room where they stood at my side, with nowhere to go.
This bleak world takes on its own tragic beauty and is tempered by understanding, compassion and love. Similarly, the petty mother becomes the guardian angel who leads the child onto the fields of praise. And the giggling relatives are transformed into the splendid mythic characters of A Child's Christmas in Wales, where they take their rightful places alongside wolves and birds the colour of red flannel petticoats and bears and the English. In A Story, Dylan creates the hilarious, impossible, but deeply loving picture of an aunt and uncle at odds about an outing.
I was staying at the time with my uncle and his wife. Although she was my aunt, I never thought of her as anything but the wife of my uncle, partly because he was so big and trumpeting and red-hairy and used to fill every inch of the hot little house like an old buffalo squeezed into an airing cupboard, and partly because she was so small and silk and quick and made no noise at all as she whisked about on padded paws, dusting the china dogs, feeding the buffalo, setting the mouse-traps that never caught her. And once she sneaked out of the room to squeak in a nook or nibble in the hayloft. You forgot she'd ever been there. But there he was, always, a steaming hulk of an uncle, his braces straining like hawsers, crammed behind the counter of the tiny shop at the front of the house, and breathing like a brass band, or guzzling and blustery in the kitchen over his gutsy supper, too big for everything except the great black boats of his boots. She was so small she could hit him only if she stood on a chair, and every Saturday night at 10:30 he would lift her up under his arm onto a chair in the kitchen so that she could hit him on the head with whatever was handy, which was always a china dog. On Sundays, and when pickled, he sang high tenor and had won many cups. The first I heard of the annual outing was when I was sitting one evening on a bag of rice behind the counter under one of my uncle's stomachs, reading an advertisement for sheep dip, which was all there was to read.
But Dylan, unlike the two men under the railway bridge, did have somewhere to go. He just wasn't always very sure of where it was. It took another 11 years for Dylan to settle in Larne, to understand that he had come home. In the meantime, he kept up his frantic pursuit of something beyond him, chasing from one place to another, juggling debts and friends and favours. In order to regain paradise, you have to know that you have lost it. In order to regain paradise, you have to lose it. In October 1938, he owed so much money in Larne that he had to leave rather quickly. In May 1939 he returned, now with both wife and child. Again he left in the autumn. Again he returned in the spring of 1940. Again he had to sneak away because of his debts. Back in Wales he started to write again. The best, the clearest, the most profound poems of his life. Dylan's work of this period has such a quality and a depth that his position as a major poet was established beyond any doubt with the publication of Deaths and Entrances in 1946. Poem in October, written for the occasion of his birthday, is a song to the joy of life.
It was my 30th year to heaven, woke to my hearing from harbour and neighbour wood, and the mussel-pooled and heron-priested shore, the morning beckon, with water praying and call of seagull and rook, and the knock of sailing boats on the net-webbed wall, myself to set foot that second in the still sleeping town, and set forth. My birthday began with the water birds, and the birds of the winged trees flying my name above the farms and the white horses, and I rose in rainy autumn and walked abroad in a shower of all my days. High tide, and the heron dived when I took the road over the border, and the gates of the town closed as the town awoke. Pale rain over the dwindling harbour, and over the sea-wet church the size of a snail, with its horns through the mist and the castle brown as owls. But all the gardens of spring and summer were blooming in the tall tales beyond the border and under the lark-full cloud. There could I marvel my birthday away, but the weather turned around. And there could I marvel my birthday away, but the weather turned around. And the true joy of the long-dead child sang burning in the sun. It was my 30th year to heaven, stood there then in the summer noon, though the town below lay leaved with October blood. Oh, may my heart's truth still be sung on this high hill in a year's turning.
For a brief moment, he had recaptured paradise, that place where the joy of the long-dead child sang burning in the sun. The moment was, however, very brief. He went back to England after the war in September 1945. He did work for the BBC and wrote film scripts. He scrounged, begged, and simply took from his friends and admirers. Eventually, in 1946, they moved to Oxford, where they stayed until 1949. Despite his success and his fame, things were going badly for Dylan. His wife was jealous of his patron. He was jealous of his wife. The Inland Revenue was after him. The BBC was tired of his failure to meet deadlines, and his publishers were more and more wary. Friends were tiring of his behaviour. Literary fashion was moving on, and the enfant terrible was not quite as amusing now that he had become a middle-aged man terrible. What could he do but try and escape?
We're almost there. The end's in sight.
And did he never come back again?
For several years he tried to emigrate to the United States, but without success. Then, confronted with so many problems, he turned on England, as he had earlier turned on Wales. England was the cause of his unhappiness. England, that dark and savage country, inhabited by a curious and maybe cannibal race.
There, all about me, chastely dropping with gloved and mincing just so fingers saccharin tablets into their cups of stewed Thames water, or poising their cigarette holders like blowpipes, or daintily raising the little finger crooked a currant bun to the snapping flash of their long, strong teeth, tall and terrible women neighed. Women inaccessible as goat crags. Nowhere on all this smacked and blossoming earth at home, except on lofty cold bicycles with baskets at the front full of lettuce, library books and starchless bread, aloofly scything along the high, the wind never raising their sensible skirts, and their knitted pastel stockings full of old hockey muscles. There, all about me, long, thin accents with yellow waistcoats and carefully windswept hair, one lock over the eye, bleated and fluted. In a drawl of corduroy at the tea-urn, vowels were plucked and trussed. I did not want to be in England now that they were there. I did not want to be in England, whether they were there or not.
Suddenly he sees himself in exile in that awful place called England, rolling the word Wales around my tongue like a gobstopper of magical properties. Suddenly he longs for the warmer, simpler and more direct life of South Wales, and even a word or two of Welsh, the real language of home, appears in his work.
The primitive, dark promenade of hidden loves after chapel, the long, low Sunday whistle to make the girls turn round, and always mine had glasses. The rattle of the milk cart Monday morning, and the first tram hissing like a gander to the steelworks. The hunchback streets on Sunday morning, men with white mufflers and lean dogs waiting for a miracle outside the pub, shut like a tomb, and the Beatles passing them by with their noses and brollies in the air. The sound of the colliers' voices at night left on the air above the crippled street. No star, Will, no star, Johnny, no star, Evan, no star. No star. And the stars coming out sweet as the smell of fish and chips. Anything would do to remember, to ward off the pinstriped wolves. Remember the shop at the corner? Mrs. Evans, the pop, full of licorice bootlaces, lamp oil, pear drops, and a smell that was comfier than roses. The front parlour, which nobody ever entered, save the preacher on special occasions, or sometimes the committee members of the Mothers' Union, or a rare relative from England, or another foreign country. And, of course, the family mourners every now and then, to sit on the edges of the unused chairs and hear the voice of the clock ticking their own lives away between the two china dogs.
The world he describes is that of the two men under the railway bridge, but the attitude is totally different. And perhaps, just as in his most violent attacks on Wales, a part of the ugliness he described was only in the eye of the beholder, so a part of the beauty he now described was also only in the eye of the beholder. However, a quality of a good dream is that it seems real.
The ugly, lovely, at least to me, town is alive, exciting and real, though war has made a hideous hole in it. I do not need to remember a dream. The reality is there. The fine, live people, the spirit of Wales itself.
So he came back then?
Yes, he did.
In May 1949, with Caitlin pregnant again, the Thomas family moved to the boathouse, the house perched on the rocks above the sea, with which he has become so closely associated. Here Dylan found both the womb and the view. Here he reconciled the boys as innocent as strawberries with the hunchback. In a broadcast, he described the village he first went to in 1938.
Off and on, up and down, high and dry, man and boy. I've been living now for 15 years, or centuries, in this timeless, beautiful, balmy, both spellings town, in this far, forgetful, important place of herons, cormorants, castle, churchyard, gulls, ghosts, geese, feuds, scares, scandals, cherry trees, mysteries, jackdaws in the chimneys, bats in the belfries, skeletons in the cupboards, pubs, mud, cockles, flatfish, curlews, rain, and human, often all too human beings. And though still very much a foreigner, I'm hardly ever stoned in the streets any more. Other people are envious. They envy Larne, its minding of its own strange business, its sane disregard for haste, its generous acceptance of the follies of others, having so many ripe and piping of its own. Its insular feather-bed air of it will all be the same in 100 years' time. They deplore its right to be, in their eyes, so wrong, and to enjoy it so much as well.
Does Dylan Thomas deserve all the attention he gets?
No. Because he wasted his life when he went over America.
Yeah, I do think he deserves all the attention he gets. Like, mainly,
No. Well, I suppose he is local and he is famous.
Well, yes, why not? I mean, he was a celebrity, wasn't he? He was internationally known and all that. So yes, he does.
Well, it's a good thing, because I think he would have enjoyed the attention if he was still alive.
Well, he's gone, isn't he? I mean, why not give the attention to somebody that's living?
We made it. Almost. I thought we were there.
Things are never that simple.
Soon. Soon.
In 1950, Dylan Thomas was invited to undertake a lecture tour in North America. In 3.5 months, he gave almost 40 readings and lectures, and travelled from New York to Los Angeles, from Vancouver to Florida. As an artist, the trip was very successful. His stature as a poet was confirmed, as was his gift as a reader of poetry. On a personal level, Dylan met, and was often befriended, by many of the major figures in the cultural life of North America. Financially, the trip was also very successful. However, most of the money disappeared as quickly as it was earned, and the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow was spent on drink, instead of on the bills that piled up back in Larne, where Caitlin and 3 children waited impatiently. Dylan also created for himself a most undesirable reputation as a loud-mouthed and badly behaved drunkard. Some things, as they say, never change. His affair with one particular woman almost led to the breakdown of his marriage. Some things, as they say. As he was still without money, he wanted to go back to the States, but Caitlin would only agree if she went with him. Far from solving certain problems, her presence added others, for now there were 2 extremely badly behaved people for their hosts to contend with, and there were 2 to drink the profits away. On his second trip, he gave even more readings and stayed even longer. Dylan and Caitlin returned to Larne with as many, if not more, problems than when they left. So again Dylan set off across the Atlantic in April 1953, and again in October 1953. Dylan had survived for many years without much money, but now he could not handle wealth. He had survived all sorts of problems and difficulties, but he did not handle public acclaim and star treatment. His success allowed his bad habits, rather than his good habits, to develop. His success killed him. Yet as his life became rapidly more difficult, the joy of life burst in on his work. Under Milkwood had been thought of many years before, for the idea of a village declared insane, but which was in fact the last remaining sane place in the world, had been sparked off by the horrors of the war. In 1953, Dylan worked quickly on this play for voices, creating out of his memories of Newquay and Larne a picture of some other world where people went about the business of life in their own eccentric ways. At the beginning of the play, Dylan imagined the character of the blind sea captain, Captain Cat, who listens from his window as the village comes back to life on a sunny spring morning.
All the women are out this morning in the sun. You can tell it's spring. There goes Mrs. Cherry. You can tell it's her by her trotters. Off she trots, new as a daisy. Who's that talking by the pump? Mrs. Floyd and Boyo, talking flatfish. What can you talk about flatfish? That's Mrs. Diebread one, waltzing up the street like a jelly. Every time she shakes, it's slap, slap, slap. Who's that? Mrs. Butcher Bainon with her pet black cat. It follows her everywhere, meow and all. Oh, there goes Mrs. 23, important. The sun gets up and goes down in her dewlap. When she shuts her eyes, it's night. Oh, high heels now, in the morning too. Mrs. Rose Cottage's eldest, 17 and never been kissed. Ho, ho, ho. Going young and milking under my window to the field with the nanny goats. She reminds me all the way. Can't hear what the women are gabbing around the pump. Same as ever. Who's having a baby? Who blacked whose eye? Seen Polly Garter giving her belly an airing? There should be a law. Seen Mrs. Bainon's new mauve jumper? It's her old grey jumper dyed. Who's dead? Who's dying? There's a lovely day. Oh, the cost of soap flakes.
Dylan was dying, and this sparkling picture of the richness of life came out of his last few months. Dylan Thomas was dying far away in New York. Dylan Thomas died before he completed Under Milkwood. This wonderful song in praise of life remains his best known and his best loved work, simple, clear, full of light and joy. On November the 5th, Dylan fell into a coma, exhausted, ill, in a hotel in New York. On November the 9th, 1953, he died. Dylan Thomas was a poet who wrote of birth, of death, and despite or because of his fear of death, of the joy of life. Dylan Thomas eventually found, in the people and the places of Wales, what he needed to recapture his lost paradise, that for him, and for us through his poetry, will always be at Fern Hill.
And then to awake, and the farm like a wanderer white with dew come back, the cock on his shoulder. It was all shining. It was Adam and Maiden. The sky gathered again, and the sun grew round that very day. So it must have been after the birth of the simple light, in the first spinning place, the spellbound horses walking warm out of the whinnying green stable onto the fields of praise. And honoured among foxes and pheasants by the gay house under the new-made clouds, and happy as the heart was long, in the sun borne over and over, I ran my heedless ways. My wishes raced through the house-high hay, and nothing I cared at my sky-blue trades, that time allows in all his tuneful turning, so few and such morning songs, before the children green and golden follow him out of grace, Nothing I cared in the lamb-white days, that time would take me up to the swallow-thronged loft by the shadow of my hand, in the moon that is always rising, nor that riding to sleep I should hear him fly with the high fields, and wake to the farm forever fled from the childless land. Oh, as I was young and easy in the mercy of his means, time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea.